Why do some people readily accept authoritarian rule, while others resist it at great personal cost? The answer isn't simply political preference. Democracy and autocracy are not just competing systems of government. They are reflections of something much deeper, a biological and psychological balancing act happening inside each of us. This discussion breaks down the scientific mechanisms that cause populations to either comply with authoritarian rule or build democratic resilience. We will see that the roots of political behavior are found in our personal histories and our relationship with the institutions we move through every day. At the heart of human political behavior is a fundamental conflict between two competing evolutionary instincts: a self-preservation drive focused on safety and order that becomes especially powerful during times of perceived threat. On the other side is a more recent evolutionary development: the capacity for cooperation, the ability for shared problem-solving, empathy, and critical reasoning. These two forces are always in dynamic tension. And here's the critical takeaway: democracy is not our biological default. It requires intentional, sustained effort to lift our pro-social cooperative selves over the more primal instinct to hide safely behind authority. Inside the brain, this evolutionary tension plays out between two competing systems. The fear center, primarily the amygdala, processes threat and drives us toward the safety of established hierarchies. The logic center, the prefrontal cortex, manages goal-directed planning, active coping, and independent decision-making. Under normal conditions, these systems balance each other. But here's where it gets politically significant. Prolonged stress or trauma physically compromises the logic center. When that happens, the fear center dominates, and compliance, submission to a strong leader or an established hierarchy, begins to feel like the safest and most rational choice. People are not born as blank slates. Research shows that we each arrive with varying baseline tendencies. Some of us are genetically inclined toward strict order and hierarchy, others toward openness and questioning. But genetics alone does not determine our political behavior. Our daily environment acts as a massive amplifier of whatever baseline tendencies we have. Ultimately, a person's political behavior is shaped by how the schools they attended, the workplaces they inhabit, and the communities they belong to have interacted with their psychology across their lifetime. It's not nature or nurture. It's nature amplified by nurture. Institutions often exploit the ancient human drive for obedience, not necessarily through malicious intent, but through the cumulative effect of their structures. Across a lifetime, individuals pass through a sequence of environments that systematically erode the belief that their actions matter. It begins in childhood, where transactional environments of education teach passive intellectual dependence. It deepens in young adulthood through rigid ideological conditioning, and it is reinforced throughout adulthood in economically insecure workplaces that offer no real voice or agency. Each stage of the funnel narrows the individual's sense of power until what drips out at the bottom is political apathy and compliance. The conditioning process begins in the classroom. Traditional schooling operates on a transactional model of education, where the teacher deposits information into passive student recipients. The structure of large, centralized school districts mirrors top-down corporate management, teaching students that genuine participation in governance is beyond their reach. The method treats students as receptacles rather than thinkers, and the result is profound. Students internalize intellectual submission. They are conditioned from an early age to accept unchallenged narratives from authority figures, precisely the behavior that makes populations vulnerable to autocratic leadership later in life. If school plants the seed of submission, the workplace waters it daily. The average adult spends the majority of their waking life inside corporate environments, defined by strict, non-democratic hierarchies, where authority is unaccountable and decisions flow only downward. Layer onto this the chronic stress of economic insecurity, job instability, variable pay, and a lack of control over employment outcomes, and you have the perfect conditions for learned helplessness to take root. The result is what researchers call the apathy mechanism. Because workers have no voice at work, they gradually lose the motivation and the cognitive habit of exercising their voice in civic life. When the brain's fear center is constantly activated by uncontrollable environments, two self-reinforcing psychological states lock into place. The first is conditioned apathy, the deeply internalized belief that individual actions simply cannot change the system. Why vote? Why protest? Nothing I do matters. The second is a defense of the status quo. Because the world feels chaotic and uncontrollable, individuals begin to rationalize and defend existing hierarchies, even profoundly unfair ones. Because familiar order, however unjust, feels safer than the complexity of change. Together, these two states create a feedback loop that makes populations extraordinarily vulnerable to authoritarian consolidation. Here is the good news. Compliance is not permanent. Just as helplessness is conditioned into people through repeated exposure to uncontrollable environments, active resilience and critical thought can be intentionally cultivated through the opposite experience. The research is clear. Controllability, like helplessness, can be learned. A functioning democracy therefore requires that society deliberately build environments that counteract fear and foster three core traits in its citizens: independent logic, the ability to think critically and question authority; moral courage, the willingness to act on one's convictions despite personal risk; and shared problem solving, the cooperative capacity that makes collective action possible. We can now draw a clear contrast between two citizen profiles that emerge from these different conditioning environments. The compliant mindset is characterized by three features: a core belief that one's actions cannot change the system, and that inequality is unavoidable; an uncritical acceptance of strong leaders; and a reliance on external direction, from hierarchical authority or even from fate. The resilient mindset is its direct opposite: a belief that actions matter and that systems can and should be questioned; independent assessment based on evidence and logic; and direction that comes from within, from personal principles and shared community goals. These are not fixed personality types. They are learned orientations, and they can be changed. The most powerful antidote to the transactional education model is critical pedagogy, a fundamentally different approach to learning. Rather than depositing information into passive students, critical pedagogy builds resilience through three interconnected steps. First, shared problem solving, replacing lecture-based instruction with active, participatory learning, where students analyze and debate complex real-world issues. Second, building efficacy. When students are permitted to make genuine decisions about classroom rules or project direction, they learn early that their input has tangible impact. And third, intellectual autonomy, training the brain's logic center to interrogate dominant narratives rather than simply absorbing them. This is how schools become incubators of democratic resilience. The solution to the apathy-generating workplace is not simply better management, it is structural participation. Think of it as behavioral therapy for political disengagement. The most effective treatment for political apathy is giving adults genuine control over their daily economic lives. This means policies that mandate worker co-management or co-determination, giving employees a real, tangible stake in outcomes. When economic environments are secure and participatory, they stop chronically triggering the brain's fear center, freeing cognitive and emotional resources for civic engagement. The overlap between worker voice and business direction isn't just good management, it is daily democratic practice that builds the habits democracy requires. A third pillar of democratic resilience is independent community institutions, especially those that provide a moral framework for resistance. Many faith traditions carry what scholars call the prophetic tradition, a doctrinal basis for challenging unjust rulers and defining constructive dissent not as rebellion, but as a sacred duty. Beyond moral framing, community groups and religious congregations provide safe infrastructure, independent meeting spaces, and trusted local networks that give people the physical and social safety required to organize. But critically, this capacity for resistance depends entirely on institutional independence. Organizations that are financially or structurally dependent on the state lose their ability to serve as resilient sources of dissent. All the internal resilience in the world is undermined if the external political system is visibly corrupt and unresponsive. Citizens who are told their vote matters but watch corporate money dominate political outcomes will rationally conclude the system is rigged, and that conclusion is the final external justification for seeking an autocratic strongman who promises to cut through the corruption. The structural fix is direct. States possess the constitutional authority to use their corporate chartering power to explicitly deny corporations the right to spend in political campaigns. When corporate money is removed, the system becomes more genuinely responsive to citizens. And when citizens see that responsiveness, belief in democracy is restored, neutralizing the psychological appeal of authoritarianism. We close with the central conclusion of this entire analysis. Political compliance is not a character flaw. It is the predictable, measurable result of unmanaged fear and rigid institutions that have conditioned people out of their own agency over a lifetime. Democracy, by contrast, is not a default setting. It is not something that simply sustains itself once established. It is a continuously maintained balance, a deliberate, active practice. By intentionally redesigning our schools, our workplaces, and our community centers to support genuine participation, we tip the scale away from autocratic governance. We rebuild the logic center. We restore political efficacy. And we build the capacity for the democratic resilience that a free society depends upon.